So let's talk about something big. What is it that actually holds a society together? I mean, what are those invisible foundations that shape our values, our laws, and even our sense of who we are? We're about to dive into a source text that makes a really powerful and honestly pretty provocative argument about Western civilization. And it all kicks off with one simple metaphor.
This is it. This is the line that's at the absolute heart of the text we're looking at. They want the fruit without the tree. It's such a striking image, right? And it immediately makes you ask a couple of things. First, what exactly is this fruit? And maybe more importantly, what's the tree that it's supposed to grow from? Let's unpack that.
All right, so to get what that means, we've got to start with the tree. What is this original foundation? According to the source, it's the core structure that grew the values so many of us in the West kind of take for granted today.
Now, at the very heart of this tree is something the source calls a meta-narrative. I know, it's a kind of academic term, but you can just think of it as a society's big, overarching story. It's the story that tells us who we are, where we came from, and what makes life worth living. It's the framework that gives everything else, from our laws to our personal goals, its ultimate purpose. The source then explains how this big story plays out in the real world. As you can see here, the argument is that society really flourishes when three key institutions are in balance. The family, that's where our character is formed. The church is what shapes our conscience. And the government, its job is to keep order and restrain evil. The text really emphasizes that this balance is everything. If one of these tries to do the job of another, the whole system starts to wobble. Okay, so that's the tree. But what happens when you start taking an axe to its roots? This is where we get to the core argument of the source material, this idea that modern society is trying to get by on borrowed meaning. And as the text suggests, that inheritance is starting to run pretty low. This is really the key tension, right? The argument is that as society moves away from its religious foundations, it's not actually inventing totally new values from scratch. Instead, it's trying to keep the fruit, cherished values like compassion and human dignity, while cutting down the tree, which in this case is the Christian theological framework. The source likens it to living off a huge inheritance of spiritual capital, without ever putting anything back into the account. So what does that actually look like in practice? Well, the source gives us some pretty powerful examples. Let's start with human dignity. The text argues that the idea that every human has inherent worth isn't just obvious. It claims it's borrowed directly from the belief that humans are made in the image of a creator, which is what gives them that intrinsic value. And you see this same logic applied to something like forgiveness. The source suggests that our cultural ideal of forgiveness is actually really hard to sustain on its own. It's presented as an echo of a much deeper theological concept, grace, this idea of radical, unearned mercy. The argument is that without that foundation, we just naturally default to keeping score and demanding retribution. Our idea of justice is another big one. The source connects our passionate desire for justice in the world today to a foundational belief in a final judge who will, one day, make everything right. From this viewpoint, it's the belief in that ultimate accountability that gives our earthly fight for justice its deep, profound meaning. And just one more example, the whole idea of sacrifice. I mean, why would anyone make a huge sacrifice for someone else, or for a cause bigger than themselves? The source claims this value is anchored in a belief in eternal hope, a deep-seated conviction that our actions matter beyond our own short lifespan. Without that hope, the text suggests, grand sacrifice starts to look, irrational. So what's the end game here? If a society really is trying to have the fruit without the tree, what happens next? Well, this leads us to what the source calls the great unraveling. This right here, this is the turning point in the whole argument. The idea is that you can live on borrowed meaning for a while, maybe even a few generations, but the text claims that eventually that spiritual bank account just runs out. The memory of why we hold these values fades, and then the values themselves start to crumble. And when it does run out, what does that unraveling actually look like? The source points to a bunch of symptoms. Our institutions start to feel hollow. Our politics gets more and more tribal. Families weaken. Our shared sense of meaning fractures. And all of this leads to rising instability, anxiety, and just this deep, profound sense of cultural exhaustion. The text presents these as the direct results of that foundational collapse. And the ultimate conclusion of this whole process is, it's pretty bleak. The idea is that when that shared story disappears, you don't get freedom. You get fragility. The source argues that society becomes brittle, unable to handle shocks because the very beliefs that once held it all together have just dissolved. But, after that really stark diagnosis, the text doesn't just leave us there. It actually proposes a way forward, which it calls a return to the root. And the source is really, really clear on this point. The answer isn't going to be found in better politics or catchier slogans. It argues that those are just surface-level fixes for a problem that goes way, way deeper. Real renewal, it claims, can only come from returning to the truth that was left behind.
So the path it lays out has these three, spiritual steps, not political ones. First, repentance, which is just about turning back. Then, humility, basically an admission that this experiment with borrowed meaning has failed. And finally, recognition. This is a renewed recognition of the specific Christian foundation the source has been pointing to all along, the idea of Christ as the true anchor for meaning, morality, and civilization itself.
And all of this really brings us to one final massive question. Stepping back from this one particular text, you have to ask, is some kind of shared story, a meta-narrative, actually essential for a society to hold together? And if the answer is yes, then what on earth happens when we can no longer agree on what that story should be?